Ayam nija paroveti gananala guche tasam udara charitanam tu vasudhaiva kutumbakam. That this is mine and that is yours is the reckoning of those of small minds. But to those whose lives are noble, the whole world is one family. Do you realize how fortunate we are in this country? Sri Ramakrishna had 16 or 17 monastic disciples, and 5 of them came to the United States. Just imagine. Well, we are hearing every day, every week, about Swami Vivekananda in one way or another. So I'm not talking about Swamiji this morning. I'm talking about the other 4, the 4 that we don't know quite so well as we know him. And I expect to tell you a little more than you might have known before. But they are Swami Saradananda, Swami Turiyananda, Swami Abhedananda, and Swami Trigunatitananda. And the first is Swami Saradananda. This was a young man who came to Sri Ramakrishna, and the master asked him, "What is your ideal?" And he said, "I want to see the divine in every living being." And Sri Ramakrishna said, "Well, you can't do that right away." And Sharat said, "Well, I'll plug along until I do." The master was very pleased at that answer. He was a great friend of Swamiji's. They were pals, you could say, and they were so close that some people used to call them the cup and the saucer. And Swamiji was the cup and the Saradananda was the saucer. He was called by Swamiji in 1896 to come to the West. He knew he had a good background in education, and he had a spiritual allegiance that would be serving him the rest of his life. So he called on him to come and help him in the West, particularly starting in London. And the Swami Saradananda was very reluctant to do that. He would not. He said, I have no practice in speaking. I'm not a speaker. I have no spirituality," and so on. Kept saying those things. Finally, he went to Holy Mother and told her, "Look, Naran has asked me to go to the West and help him in his public work. How can I do that?" And she said, in spite of the loss to her, because he was helping her, "Go. Naran has called you, you go. He will help you with everything you need." So he came. He went to London, and he arrived there before Swamiji. Swami Vivekananda was coming from America. And Swami Saradananda arrived first, and he went to the home of Mr. Sturdy, who was already a disciple of Vivekananda. And they were in a suburb of London. And the first thing that the two Swamis did after they met was to learn to ride a bicycle. And Mr. Sturdy said there was nothing so funny as to see these two corpulent figures trying to balance on bicycles in the countryside. So that was his introduction to the West. His life in London, Swami Saradananda's life in London, was very subservient to Swamiji. They lived in the same rented houses or loaned houses, and they were very happy there and chummy together in those places. But he was very subservient. He was like a little dog. He said, "I'm like a little puppy at the heels of Swamiji." And one night, something happened that was surprising for Swami Sarananda. Swamiji opened the door and said, I want to introduce to you a gentleman of my acquaintance. And the man came in dressed in British clothes, top hat and all that, and very properly dressed. And introduced him to Swami Sarananda. And Swami Sarananda was a little bit suspicious because he thought he knew the voice. And so the man took off his hat, and it was Swami Yogeshananda. That was a Vivekananda joke. Well, he began writing the biography of Sri Ramakrishna. You know, that great book, The Great Master. He began writing it in London, his time in London. And it took, of course, years to write it. But he started it, and he did some of his research there. And now, of course, he was in a position, Swamiji felt, to take a new post, and he sent him to the United States. He got Goodwin, his faithful secretary, to accompany him and go to the United States and take up the work in New York. Swamiji had founded, you know, in this country 2 centers, one in New York and one in San Francisco. These are the only 2 centers that were founded by Vivekananda. So the work in London, in New York, was going on, and Swamiji entrusted it to Sarananda, and he headed the New York Vedanta Society for more than 2 years. He made it a special friend of people of a family in New Jersey. This family were the Wheelers. Their name was Wheeler. And it was his home away from home. Swami Sarananda was naturally lonely, and he had made friends with the Wheelers, and he mixed with them and learned a great deal about America, just as Swamiji had learned from the Hale house, from the Hale sisters. So he learned from the Wheelers. And he did a lot of interfaith work. Swami Sarananda went to the Green Acre Conference, set two years in a row, and spoke, and of course he mixed with the other religious leaders, and did noble work in interfaith. He mixed with Swamiji's great friends, the ones that had known Swamiji, that made important people like William James, and the professors at Harvard. He was invited also. He also spoke at Harvard, by the way. And he mixed with these people. And people afterwards were asked to describe the difference between the 2 Swamis. What was the main difference between Swami Vivekananda and Swami Sarananda? And the answer was always that the difference was between the sun and the moon. Swamiji Vivekananda was the blazing sun of knowledge, and Swami Sarananda was the cool moon of meditation and devotion. He made that contrast between them. Well, eventually, Swami Vivekananda called him back, and back to India, because the order had been formed, and a good foundation had been formed for the work of the order. And Swamiji knew that Sarananda was the prime person to take up the managing of that work. So he called him back from America to India, and installed him as the secretary of his organization. Swami Brahmananda was the president, and Swami Sarananda was the general secretary, and he had to do the major part of the organizing of the Indian work. That was entrusted to him. And so he left in January of '98, and on the way home, Swami Sharadananda visited Europe. He saw France, Italy, and in Italy he went to St. Paul's Cathedral and had samadhi in that cathedral. That's a very interesting fact. He told people afterwards, I had samadhi in St. Paul's Cathedral. Well, he spent the rest of his life in India. He became Holy Mother's servant and guardian. He had 2 houses built for her, one in Jairambati, her village, and one in Calcutta, which was Udbodhan now. And he did everything that he could to make Holy Mother's life convenient and cheerful and happy and supportive. And he was the contact person for the West. Whenever problems came up at the Mott and in the work in India, everyone would come to Sharadananda and apply for advice on matters that pertain to the West. And he would know the people to talk to and to write to and how to make arrangements with Westerners. His outstanding features as a personality were gentleness and dignity. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, characteristic of man, the real characteristic of man is dignity. No one who does not have dignity can call himself a man. Well, Swami Sharadananda embodied it. And he was gentle, he very seldom scolded. Swami Yogeshananda, whom some of you might knew, and I knew, wrote a semi-biography of him, and it tells about how he never was scolded, he was never upbraided, he was always up and cheerful and gentle, pleading in his requests to these disciples, to his students. One day, when Swami Yogeshananda had come back to India, he was walking with Swami Sharadananda to the bank or some such place, some office, government office. And you know how Swamiji was. He would get impatient with his brother disciples and his disciples. And he would upbraid, scold, criticize, everything that he could to get a rise out of him. And he, on the way home from this business, he started scolding Sharadananda right and left, gave him all kinds of insults and told him he was a fool and he was doing everything wrong. Swami Sharadananda, yes, never said a word, never talked back, just smiled and walked along. Swamiji turned to him and said, you have the blood of a fish. He gave a very nice piece of advice to us who work in the West. He said, when you work in the West, he told it to his younger brothers who were going over, among monastic brothers, you'll go over there. Some people will call you a prince, a god, elevate you to the skies. Others will condemn you with words of damnation. You must know all the time, all you are is just another worker in the Lord's vineyard. That puts it pretty well. And we must move on and talk about Swami Turiyananda. So we had 2 years and a little more of the service of Sharadananda. in New York mostly, New Jersey. Swami Turiyananda was a contemplative. He was austere and yet very loving. Now that's a nice combination to consider. How can you be austere and yet loving? Well, one has to read his life, his letters, his counsels, and his biography. You have to read about him to know what it means to be austere and yet very loving. Swami Turiyananda read the Bhagavad Gita every morning straight through before breakfast. Maybe you have a couple of chapters, or maybe you have a few verses that you read before breakfast, like me, but he read the whole Gita before he would take a single bite. So Swamiji Vivekananda wanted him, above all brothers, he wanted him to come to the West to be the example. He said, I want to show Americans what a real sadhu yogi can be. I want to show Americans the very best that India has to offer in the way of a holy man. Just living the life. Needn't be a lecturer, but just live the life. He said the West needs to see the picture of an ideal yogi. Swami Turiyananda, as I told you, came first to England. They all came by way through London. That's the way they came. And went to New York. And he took up the work that Swami Sharadananda had left in going back to India. And Swami Turiyananda spoke at Harvard. He was intellectual enough to be called upon to do that. He wasn't a great lecturer, but he managed somehow to carry on for a year in New York, giving the classes and lectures, and meeting important people. And he stayed with that family in New Jersey, the Wheeler family, and became acquainted with them. Swami Turiyananda brought with him seeds and plants to plant in America. I don't know what happened to them. I'm sorry, I can't report to you on whether they were successful or not, but he at least had the thought to do that. And then now comes the story of Shanti Ashram. You must know that there are properties which the government holds, which are for sale, very inexpensive, very cheap. And those properties are way out in the boondocks. They're properties nobody really wants, but that's why they're cheap. And so a devotee had bought one of those properties and had not occupied it, and she turned it over to Swamiji as a gift, as a donation. And Swamiji said, all right, I'll accept it. It's way out in the desert. It's hot in summer and cold in winter, and it's not a place where people will want to live. But anyway, Swami Turiyananda is a good scout, and he will go and live and start the Shanti Ashram. I don't know whether some of you have visited it. There is an annual pilgrimage to the ashram, and I have been there only twice in my life. But it is a 160 acres in the San Antonio Valley, 6 miles from all the water supply. And on that property, one reached that property by a 4-horse stagecoach with supplies. 12 people enlisted. People who had heard Turiyananda Swami speaking in San Francisco or had known him in some other way. One of them was our own Ujjala, some of you here will remember. A dozen people went with him to camp make the first encampment on that property, so far away from civilization and so difficult to live in. It was oppressively hot in summer and oppressively cold in winter, and they had to provide for both. The first night that the dozen people arrived on that property, they slept by a haystack, big haystack. Men on one side, the women on the other. That was the first night on Ashanti Ashrama. There were classes, meditation, and lots of work. Swami Turiyananda adjusted and adapted himself to the West well enough to be able to conduct the forming of a camp, the building of a kitchen, sort of kitchen, where they could have meals. He gave classes there. He taught meditation in the meditation cabin. He organized and supervised the work of the men and the women. Imagine coming to a foreign country and being able to do all that in a place like that. It's a story you must read if you haven't read it. I hope someday some of you may be able to go there and take in the annual pilgrimage. As a note of relief, he did vacation for a little while on Santa Catalina. But Swami Turiyananda became ill. I think he had diabetes, like so many of his generation, and he suffered from it greatly, and the climates that he was in there didn't help him any. And he also experienced opposition. You can imagine. I mean, he separated the men from the women. They ate in the same dining room, but the men were on one side and women were on the other side. And they all meditated together, and they all had their classes together. But he was very strict, very strict. He didn't want any conversation except about God. Well, that's a trial for any of us. And he had Indian standards of behavior and austerity. But ultimately, he faced opposition from the campers at Shanti Ashram. And combined with his illness, he gave up and said, wrote to Swamiji, I can't take it anymore. I've got to come home. I'm too ill to do this work, and I'm not fit for it. And so he left in 1902. That means he was in America from in 1902, two full years or more. In India, Swami Turiyananda was asked to teach yoga to the recruits. See, Swamiji had recruited a small number of very devoted followers, young men who were Bengalis, and physical yoga was not well known in Bengal at that time. Swamiji knew that their bodies needed to be restored to normal activity and to be strengthened. And he told Turiyananda, you are the yogi. You will now give classes to the new Swamis in yoga. And of course he gave other classes too. But that was not a life that Swami Turiyananda wanted. And he began wandering again. He was a natural forest wanderer, a natural ascetic going off to live alone and depend upon the Lord to supply everything for him. And his wandering life again began. he met Gandhiji, and he approved of Gandhi's methods and his message. He met a number of holy people, but in 1922, his illness took him off. And let me describe to you his passing, because it's most dramatic. He was lying in bed, in his sick bed, his final bed, and he said to his attendants, "Sit me up, sit me up." And they said, "No, Maharaj, you shouldn't sit up, it won't be good for you." "Sit me up," he said, "put me up." So they put him into sitting posture, and he said, "Now the prana is leaving the feet. Now the prana is leaving the knees. The prana has come to the chest region. The prana has come to the neck." And he went off. That's how he died. Our third Swami is Swami Abhedananda. This is really a conundrum, because he spent the most time in America of any of them, and we know the least about it. The reason is that he did not send bulletins back to Belur Math. He worked as an independent, very much an independent. He always was an independent. In Baranagar Math, they gave him his own room to study in and meditate in. He was just a loner. And when he became a monk here, when he became a teacher here, he formed his own kind of following, and made his own disciples, and he didn't report back to Belur Math. So we know very little really about his life here. He was a scholar and a wandering monk. And I told you about his arrival in London, when Swamiji clothed him in British attire and then introduced him to Swami Sardananda. He stayed that was in 1896. He stayed there and for a while to learn from Swami Vivekananda how to behave in the West. He had never given a public speech, so he gave his first one there, and it was very successful. He was in London for 1 year under Swamiji, and then Swamiji sent him to New York to take up the work which Swami Sardananda and Swami Turiyananda had to abandon. So the New York Society was headed at this time now by Swami Abhedananda. He had Sunday school classes in New York, which is interesting. He taught the children stories from the Panchatantra and the Hitopadesha, and I'm sure that was on Saturday afternoons, and I'm sure their Saturday afternoons were much better spent than some Saturday afternoons are now. Anyway, in 1897, he went there to New York to replace the other Swamis, and as head, and began his public work, about which we know only too little. Somehow he managed to cross the Atlantic Ocean 17 times. We don't know where he was going, except that he had disciples and friends in all of the popular European countries. He also spoke, we know, in Alaska, in Canada, in Mexico. So you see, it was a kind of follow-up of Swami Vivekananda. He met the same kinds of people and some of the same people. He met William James and had a discussion with him which lasted for 2 or 3 hours. And William James was a philosopher and psychologist, And William James, probably the most famous American psychologist of that period. At the end of this discussion between him and Abhedananda, James said, I can't disagree with your argument. You win the argument. It was about Advaita Vedanta, how this whole universe is just really one being, and there was no division, no Dvaita. He said, I can't dispute your conclusion, but I still don't believe it. I still don't believe it. No, you can't just be an Advaitin when you see the point of an argument. He was invited to Columbia University, Harvard University, Yale, Cornell. He met and talked with all of their professors. He met Edison, the inventor, in his laboratory. Swami Abhedananda was a fine orator. If you read his speeches, they run so smoothly. You can hardly believe that an Indian, a person born in India, would be able to speak such smooth English. And but that's the way it was. He never had any problem as a speaker or teacher. He was a little diffident. He backed off from people. He wasn't intimate with people. He kept his own counsel, but he could talk on any subject. He had a different view on evolution from that of the scriptures. I think that's very interesting. The Upanishads say that in reincarnation, it's possible for the soul to go back to the lower levels, the animal levels, come back and start up. And Swami Abhedananda taught that once you reach the human level, you don't go back. We can talk about that afterwards in the library, in the living room. He bought 370 acres in the Berkshire Hills of Connecticut. We don't even know now exactly where that was. He made an ashram there, an ashrama that lasted for 9 years. Who are those people? Where are they? We only know of one. She wrote a book, thank goodness. Sister Shivani was his chief disciple. She wrote a book about all this. And so that's why we know as much as we do. I'm telling you what she wrote. It didn't last more than 9 years because apparently he did not want to make a foundation over here. He did not expect to make something that would last. And as in all such places, there are internal and internecine warfare going on and struggles between people. An ashram is a very difficult thing to maintain, very difficult. And that it lasted 9 years is to its credit. He came to Southern California, and here in our area, there is no clear record of what he did. He knew the Mead sisters, so he went to the Pasadena house. He lived in the Pasadena house. We know that. And he was very intimate with the devotees there who had been formed in Swamiji's time. He spoke in 2 places that I don't know. the Burbank Theater building. I doubt if that even exists now, but that is one of the places where he is recorded to have spoken in Southern California, the Burbank Theater building. He also worked in San Francisco, and after a year in San Francisco, in the area, and in Los Angeles, going back and forth on the train, I suppose, he finally, after this long career in our country, Swami Yogeshananda headed back to India. After, 21 years. In India, he tried to live at Belur, as you would be expected to do, but it didn't work. He had got used to American diet and the comforts and conveniences of American life after 21 years here. And I think frankly we have to say he couldn't take the austerity of Belur, the diet and so on. And so he used his seniority, his prestige, to form his own organization. It's called the Vedanta Mott, and it exists in Calcutta even to this day. He made his own sannyasins, gave vows to brahmacharis and sannyasis. So in a sense, he erected his parallel organization, though much smaller, of course, and he taught and trained sannyasins who carried on after him, primarily Swami Yogeshananda. And he lived until 1939. He was the last of Sri Ramakrishna's disciples to pass away. So I have, in answer to the question, why don't we know more about this, all of this? There are two views. His own disciples have said there was no self-promotion in him. He did not want to leave anything in his own name in this country. And the other view is that inadvertently he failed to form a lasting foundation in America, so that nothing survived him here. And our fourth and last Swami is Swami Trigunatita, or Trigunatitananda. He took the name Trigunatitananda, one who has gone beyond the three gunas, one who has the bliss of having gone beyond the three gunas. And Swamiji said to him, "Brother, your name is a little too long to handle. Take off some of it." So he dropped it and made it Trigunatita. And it is as Swami Trigunatita that he is known in San Francisco and just about everywhere else. He arrived in San Francisco to take charge of the center that Swamiji had founded in 1903, rather later than the others. And when he arrived, there were exactly 25 students. Just imagine. Well, we do things like that today. We send people out where there are only a few people. And it shouldn't be too surprising that there were 25 stalwart people ready to take lessons from a Swami. See, Swami Turiyananda had worked there, and Swami Abhedananda had worked there, so there was a kind of nucleus, but Swami Trigunatita was put in charge. One of the first things he did was to make a monastery. I had the privilege of joining in that monastery. Not in his time, No, not in his time. But the monastery which he made in 19-something, 3 or 4, still exists there. There has been somebody of a monastic vow living there continuously, one or another, from the very founding of the time. Swami Yogeshananda was very adamant about the fact that there had never been a break in the monastic life of that place. And of course, the great story about that monastery is that one of its members lived to be an old man who had left the monastery at the death of Trigunatita, married, had a child, and lived as a printer and a businessman, and then came back to the monastery and picked up his monastic life again. I knew him very well. His name was Mr. Brown, and he became a very, what should I say, notorious, very highly described individual, let's put it that way. One day, Mr. Brown, he was called Sajjana by the Swami. He found himself falling asleep, and he lay down on the floor and fell asleep. And when he woke up, he found that all the chairs in the room had been piled on top of him. That was Swami Trigunatita. He had done that. Another side of his character, a woman came in to serve him. She had cleaning to do in his room and in the center, and she regularly came and cleaned. Well, one Easter season, she came in with a hat, and you know those old hats, flowers and feathers and all those things on top. And she set it down on a table while she got ready to work. And he started talking to her vigorously, telling her now this and that, and you must take care of this, and Swami Vivekananda wanted that, and so on and so on. And he brought his fist down on that hat. And she said, "Oh, Swami." And he said, "Yes, I have ruined one expensive hat, and I have killed one ego forever." What do you think of that? Don't you want your ego killed that way? Well, he had a cupboard, a favorite cupboard, into which he, one of those long cupboards that in old-fashioned houses, you don't know what they're for, but they're just thin and long. And he used to go to that cupboard and open it and peer inside. And one of the monastery monks asked him one day, "Swamiji, why do you go and look in that closet?" And he said, "As a child, I was very much afraid of spiders. And now I go and look into that closet and reassure myself that I am no longer afraid of spiders." I know these stories because they came down from way back in the monastery. I want to read a quotation which puts the whole thing in such a good framework that better than I can do. Swami Trigunatita, this is probably Guru Das. Swami Trigunatita had many outstanding qualities. He was boundlessly loving, endlessly patient. His will was indomitable, his mind brilliant. He was at times eccentric. His way of life, his way of work, his mode of expression were all his own, and now and then astonishing. Here are some of the signs he had printed by one of the devotees who was a printer, ornately done, and mounted on the monastery walls and hung in the monastery rooms. Eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. Watch and pray. Watch and pray. Live like a hermit, work like a horse. Ours but to do and die, but you will not die. Imagine living with signs like that around you all the time. He lectured in Los Angeles, again at the Burbank Theater building, and the Brent Hall, wherever that was. Brent Hall. I suppose I could look them up on Google. I haven't done that. He made some trips, one to Virginia City, one to the Grand Canyon. He also had a short holiday on Catalina Island. His lectures were precisely analytical and logical, not emotionally moving. And we have many records of his lectures, a number of them, from Ujjala, Miss Ida Ansell, who recorded them. It was his baby, as he called her, baby. Well, it was Turiyananda who called her baby. He proposed the building of a temple and bought the plot. And in 1905, over much opposition from the members, some of the members of the society, the first 2 floors of the old temple were built and dedicated. He tried to start a convent, and that didn't succeed. That was one of his failed attempts. Another was a community at Concord, out at Concord. He tried to start a community of householders who would buy their homes and live on the property, build homes on the property and form a community. That didn't get off the ground. But April of 1906 came, and you know, the earthquake. The earthquake and fire which ravaged San Francisco City. Fortunately, it never got down to the Marina or Pacific Heights. Those parts of the city escaped that fire. Very few parts did. And the temple was saved. In 1908, the 3rd floor, with all its roof of domes, strange turrets, you've seen pictures how funny it looks. All of those went up in the 1908. Where he got the money, nobody knows. It was just like magic. It just came. That small group, that small community of believers and devotees could hardly have raised the money to build that temple, but somehow it was done. He started a magazine called The Voice of India. You can find old copies of it in the archives, which ran for some time before it fell apart. A few days after Christmas in 1915, he was giving a lecture after Christmas, giving a lecture on the platform. A young man came up with a bag, and from the bag he took a bomb and he threw a bomb onto the platform. The Swami reeled and fell back through the entrance through which you come to the platform. He lived about 3 weeks and died. So we have a martyr. We have a martyred Swami in our history. I I never could find sufficient thanks in my heart for the building that he erected and the monastery that he made.